Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to contribute to this debate today and begin by thanking everybody who's gone before me in giving heartfelt and sincere contributions. We all take issue with things that are said on the other side of our point of view, but in the main this has been a respectful and useful debate, which I hope, irrespective of the outcome of the vote when it comes, I hope will draw more attention by the community and indeed the government to the great need that we have to respect and honour our elders and to invest appropriately in an equitable palliative care system that people can rely on in Tasmania. We are all on a journey. We all have a story. We've all lost people we love, and all of us will meet a similar end one way or the other. I hope that for all of us, when those days come, that we too are mourned by people who loved us. This debate is a necessary one in several respects. One is that, as we've heard from, and I want to thank Mr. Sturgis for his thoughtful contribution, though I don't agree with his conclusion. That's the point of a conscience vote. We're all liberated to express and determine our own position. It is absolutely the case that we have witnessed things in our personal lives, or we have heard stories or been contacted by well-meaning, well-intentioned people who would seek to persuade us to their point of view. What I have sensed in this debate is conviction and goodwill. But in the end, we must be faithful to the truth as we understand it. So I'll use my opportunity today, as best I can, to stand in this place, to stand in defence of life and to defend the defenceless. And that is actually my responsibility. And there are many people in the community who are defenceless. Mr. Sturgis has just very correctly pointed out and illustrated graphically, and that's fair, a group of people, patients with particular conditions. They are very vulnerable and they need to be defended, no question. This bill seeks to defend them in a way. I accept that. We are also legislators. We're not just people with individual stories and hurts and regrets. We're also people who have a very heavy responsibility in the making of public policy to be mindful about those people for whom we will never contemplate, meet or hear from. Well, I'm just going to continue my contribution. There are many things in this world that you or I cannot stop from happening. There are many things that I would say that the proponents of this bill, well-intentioned as they are, seek to do, but in fact may find in its imperfection that it causes more harm than good. The word euthanasia itself comes from the Greek eu, meaning good or true, and thanatos, meaning death. Therefore, it is a word which is often misunderstood. And whether you choose to say euthanasia, mercy killing, assisted suicide, even the bill's proponents euphemistically use terms like dying with dignity or voluntary assisted dying. Most of these terms are simply uses of language that do potentially mislead, and I think often deliberately mislead, and portray the action in a positive way. At its core, all of those terms, with the exception of dying with dignity, simply means the act of putting to death a terminally ill or disabled person. I say with the exception of dying with dignity because, as far as I'm concerned, that is a phrase which has long been associated with quality palliative care. and in the Tasmanian context specifically, that term has been hijacked so as to suggest that without assisted suicide legislation, that people don't die with dignity. And I think that's very regretful.
No, it's not.
It reminds me of 2009 when the leader of the Greens tabled his previous iteration of this bill during Palliative Care Week, which was grossly offensive to the many good people who serve in a vocational way as palliative care nurses and doctors and carers. This bill could have, maybe should have, been termed something different. Assisted suicide bill, perhaps, or the mercy killing bill, perhaps. The terms voluntary assisted dying, frankly, is a euphemism for something much darker, potentially for vulnerable Tasmanians, the likes of which will never grace these galleries, will never contact their politician, and will never pull our shirt in public to have a word. And they're the people I'm most mindful of throughout all of this. I cannot escape the reality that previous speakers have shared about the equally deserving people who face traumatic, painful, degenerative disease which is slowly often taking their life and in a very uncomfortable way. And there's not a member of this House I know, there's not a member who is unsympathetic or uncaring or wooden to that reality. Man, that is pain. And that is the thing about being human. We are much more than animals. We have a sympathy and empathy. And I know that all 25 members of this House and every witness to this debate knows that we want to do everything that we can for everyone, not just live out an individualised life. And I don't think it's right that people should be making judgments against the motives or even the ability of members of this House to have principled reasons for rejecting this very flawed and dangerous legislation. It is an elitist moral superiority which says that to oppose this bill is to be without compassion. It's also dead wrong. What I know about those who most intensely oppose assisted suicide legislation and those who practice in the remarkable field of palliative care teaches me that no one who approaches this matter does so without a sense of compassion, and I will say as well, usually love. I'm here as a grandson and a son to those who brought me into the world. I'm a nephew. I'm a student to my former teachers. And there's no way I make a decision today ignorant to the opportunity, the perceived opportunity, and frankly the reality of the threat that laws like this pose to my older and growing older generation. I approach this matter today as a son, serving and showing honour to our older generation. I'm also here today as a father to 3 amazing children. I'm an uncle to an impressive 20 nephews and nieces. I know my children admire and look to me as a leader in their lives. They watch me much more astutely than we often realise. And I also know that my job isn't ever to follow the apparent dictates of an opinion poll, much less a biased push poll. And those of us who are dads know that we have to strive for the ideal, to be a faithful role model, a provider and a protector, like a father should be, leading with conviction, integrity and honesty. And it's with that ideal in mind, as imperfectly as I follow my own advice, that I approach this matter today. As a son, I approach this matter responsible for our older generation, and I approach this matter as a father responsible to the next. This bill does promise something that it cannot truly deliver: peaceful, dignified, compassionate, suicidal or homicidal death to those who want it as an escape from suffering, terminal illness, or even a non-terminal disability. And under the impressive banner of the word safeguards, it claims to exclude from that same death those who we now somewhat flippantly call the vulnerable. This bill will certainly not cure disease, it cannot repair disability, it will not end pain, and it can't alleviate suffering. No law made in this chamber can do any of those things. What it does do, and let's be blunt and put aside all of those positive, euphemistic other expressions that people create to make it sound like a positive law change, it creates for the first time exceptions to the well-known laws of murder in Tasmania. And that is what it does. You need to be very careful here, because to fiddle with laws of murder are making changes in often perhaps a principled or well-intentioned way, perhaps, but nonetheless fiddling with a very fundamental protection that exists in the law today. No matter where I go in this country, I am protected by that notion, that well-established principle at law, that I cannot go missing as a result of somebody else causing me harm without strong and strident action and concern. I could be a criminal and go missing and be murdered, and the law would still pursue my aggressor. It's a fundamental platform in our criminal legal system. It means the sanctity of that individual is regarded. Christians call it respecting that person as being made in the image of God. People who aren't Christians call it the sanctity of life. And still others simply call it equity or welfare.
Or human rights.
Mr. Hitting, you're right. The very secular call it human rights. And all of those terms are fair. All of those terms are fair. It means that you cannot go missing without someone pursuing your aggressor. And you need to be very careful about this, Premier. I wonder, as I believe, especially when I listened to what you had to say about your own experience, and I respect, Premier, what you had to say. I read it very carefully. And I want to bring honour to what you said about your grandmother. I do. I'm not being sarcastic or disrespectful. In fact, I want to bring honour to all of the stories that have been shared from the heart about the journey that different people have experienced.
Well, I wish you'd bring honour to James McKay, Paul Fletcher, Barbara Harling, people who over the past 24 hours have come out, one who has since suicided. That's who I hope you would bring honour to.
I bring honour to all of those lives.
Yeah.
And I bring honour to the lives of the names who will never be mentioned in this house. I bring honour to the names of those people for whom could fall through the gaps of this incredibly dangerous legislation. And I'll say this as well about the laws of murder. The laws against murder in this country and in Western societies, they are simple. They're usually very short, a couple of lines often at most. They're elegant, they're easy to understand. It's something like a universal ethic. And they're time-honoured. They're time-honoured. In democracies, they're now hundreds of years old. In this state, they'd be 160 years old or more under our own responsible government. It is the mainstream position in Western societies generally, and where you see democracy, you see laws against murder. And most often, where you see free societies and democracies, where human rights and the respect of the individual is accorded, you do not see legislation like this dangerous legislation. You don't. That is the case. I'll repeat myself. In most places where you have a democratic and free society, you do not see this dangerous legislation, Premier. I mean, if you choose to disagree, you need to be able to back it up. But the truth of the matter is, you mentioned 3 or 4 states in America.
The Netherlands.
You mentioned 3 or 4 states in America, and the reality is 90%, I will estimate, 90+% of people living in free societies do not live under this kind of dangerous legislation. And I'll say again, interfere with that simple rule that governs, that universal ethic that governs the protection of individual life, if you interfere with that, you will need to have a very complex mechanisms, not a 1 or 2 line law. You'll need a bill like this one here. You'll need a complex bound law, pages, clauses. Absent, by the way, in this case, of explanatory memoranda and clause notes, although I note that people are boasting about the role of Parliamentary Council in drafting this. Notwithstanding all of that, you need complexity. You need rules. You need protections. You need clauses that understand that you often can't trust people. I've worked in a hospital for 2 years. I've worked for a charity. I've worked for an organisation that's been a beneficiary of large estates, and I have seen that human nature at play. And that's why you need the complexity that the Premier and the Leader of the Greens seek to bring in.
They can be sent to jail.
In your best intentioned way to provide safeguards. What you've inevitably done is made a very complex piece of law, and it suffers from its own complexity.
That's just not true.
I'll make a case. I will make a case. I know that because you see, you've pre-committed to your position, you won't listen to the advice, for example, of the law. You see, you're shaking your head even before I've mentioned their name. You will not listen to the advice, for example, of the Law Society.
There's two sides to everything.
Premier, I am not and never have been a practising lawyer.
Well,
I'm not sure if you have been a practising lawyer. I think you haven't.
I certainly know
I'm
that
willing,
the law has two sides to it all the time.
I am willing to be informed by people who are. I am willing to be informed by people like the authoritative voice of the legal profession. They very carefully, and I'll come to this, they very carefully don't take a moral or ethical position. They do not take a moral or ethical position in relation to the matter of the taking of one life by another in circumstances where there is a compassionate demand. No, they don't do that. What they've done is taken a purely legal point of view, and you see, this Bush lawyer knows better.
No, I'm relying on
and that is the fact.
Office of Parliamentary Counsel, actually.
What you also need when you interfere with laws of murder and manslaughter in these weighty tomes, what you also need is you need to fix up eligibility requirements. You need to have ineligibility tests. You need to have sanctions for abuse because of human nature and what's inside.
You haven't even read the bill.
You're making my case for me. You're making my case for me. You have even needed to manipulate the making of wills. You've even needed to manipulate the way that life insurance is sold and assessed. You've even had to hardwire wills and life insurances. This is the mess you have created for yourself. Again, I'm actually running out of that concept of all this good intent. But I will be generous. I'll try to be reasonable. I'll try to be reasonable. I do believe at its guts, at its core, you have sought to be compassionate. I believe that. I believe that. But I don't believe you can do it safely. I believe, because I am willing to listen. You say that you vomit these insults, but you won't listen. You won't listen to people who have an authoritative position. I am willing. Just 2 days ago, the Law Society, so I will turn to it. The Law Society wrote to all of us. The Law Society wrote to all of us, and it's made it quite clear that while it doesn't take a position either way, in the same way that we all have to, it does not make a position either way in relation to the moral ethic involved. But what it does do is it tears apart this bill, and it says it could not possibly be passed by a responsible Parliament. That's what it says. I counted 19 fatal flaws in the advice. I have read the bill. You say I haven't read the bill. I have read the bill, and I think it's a foolish and childish insult for one Member of Parliament in here on such a grave and important issue to accuse another of not even having read the bill. It's a naive and foolish and silly comment. But I'll tell you what else I've read. I've also read what the Legal Law Society have submitted to us.
That's the least worst thing you could
I
say
suspect,
about you.
Minister, you haven't read it. Because if you had read it, you would have withdrawn the bill and you'd have had it redrafted.
No, because I disagree with the Law Society on the basis of advice from the Office of Parliamentary Counsel.
What I sense from you is a determination to ram this through. And I'll share why. Interject while I have a drink.
All right, I will. Why did you misrepresent the bill so badly before if you claim to have read it?
What I believe is that Mr Sturgis made a very correct and insightful comment. Mr Sturgis reflected on a bill that was brought to this place before I was elected in 2009, and he said you could have driven 2 buses through it. And that was the reason that he couldn't support it. And yet you
Even
did.
though it was
You see,
basically
it's a
Northern
determination. It's the motivation to ram these things through, irrespective of the danger. I put it to you, Mr Chairman. Welcome, Mr Chairman. I put it to you, Mr Deputy Speaker, that it's the same determination that we saw from the Greens in 2009. Come hell or high water, no matter how well-intentioned, but nonetheless dangerous that this bill was in 2009. It is the same motivation and, if you like, determination to crash or crash through that we're now witnessing from the new group, the new proponents on this bill. The Law Society in time doesn't permit. It outlines 19 fatal areas for this bill. And I'll quote really from just the beginning part of the long submission that the Law Society, in good faith, submitted to the proponents of this bill, but clearly has just been written off without that respect being shown. This is what they have to say. It says, possibly as a consequence of being a private member's bill.
Well, epic fail there because it was drafted by OPC.
Well, they've been very generous with you then. I'll start again. This is from the Law Society of Tasmania.
It was drafted by the Office of Parliamentary Counsel.
This is what the Law Society of Tasmania has to say. It does make a statement in relation to, perhaps because it's being a private member's bill, but the Minister saying that that's not the reason makes the issue even more egregious, that the Minister has used and the Premier has used Parliamentary Counsel and they haven't had it adequately checked past the profession. But nonetheless, I'll provide the quote. Possibly as a consequence of being a private member's bill, the bill suffers from some fundamental drafting errors. The bill suffers from a lack of consultation prior to tabling. There are gaps in the process and understanding of medical professional responsibilities that ought to be remedied before the bill is debated. These gaps could be resolved with proper consultation with the relevant government agencies and relevant representative groups of the medical and legal professions. Mr Deputy Speaker, time doesn't permit, but what I want to say is that the Law Society, again, do not take, unlike the AMA, which does take a principled position on the ethic, unlike the AMA, the Law Society doesn't take a principled position in relation to what is at the core of euthanasia, mercy killing or assisted suicide. But what it does do is it tears this bill apart and it describes it as very dangerous, and it makes it very clear that for anybody who was actually interested in introducing assisted suicide law into Tasmania, they nonetheless could not vote for this bill because of the danger that it poses. So if anybody here is to be described, if you like, as ideologically motivated, I have to submit it is those who are genuinely of the view that euthanasia is a good thing, but who would support this bill as flawed as it is.
Well, you're not in that position.
I freely admit I am not in that position, but it's entirely reasonable for any member of this House to point out a bill that's dangerous. If you're for euthanasia or against it, a member ought be empowered to highlight to this House the danger of the law upon which we're about to vote.
Professor Otlowski says the bill has...
Well, I'm glad you mentioned
safeguards.
Professor Otlowski. I'll just make one quick comment on that. I want to reflect on the fact that in the Leader of the Greens speech yesterday, which was listened to with respect and I believe without interjection, the Minister made a point, a a grand point of reading from a paragraph from a letter written by Professor Otlovsky, where the professor endorses this very flawed legislation. I find that very interesting that an eminent legal mind would put their name to this very dangerous, very and demonstrably flawed legislation.
Of law.
Well, I can tell you one thing, professor means nothing in here. We are all equal, we all have an equal voice, and I'll continue. And I just found it interesting that the professor is in conflict with the Law Society, a very fundamental conflict, The Law Society point out 19 fatal errors in this bill. The professor, whom I do not know, but nonetheless endorses the legislation, and yet later in the day the Premier, in her contribution, advises this House of Professor Otlovsky's involvement in helping to draft the legislation. Now I do find that unacceptable, that we would be put in the position that we only actually find out about that when it is advised in a secondary fashion. And it is only for those people involved, both the Law Society and the professor, to reconcile their differences, but this House ought to know that, and members need to vote in an informed way. Mr Deputy Speaker, our laws, I hope, will maintain social order and fairness and protect the human rights and individual dignity of Tasmanians. I want a law that will protect everyone. I want a law that will protect everyone. I am concerned for everyone. I am concerned for everyone. I am concerned for the strong when they become weak. I am concerned for the weak when they become weaker. You can't say that, Mr Booth. We are all here, I hope, in goodwill.
Of course I can say that.
The last thing I would want, I hope I could say the last thing you would want, is to pass bad law. If you must bring in a euthanasia bill, bring in one that provides cover for people who are vulnerable. And then we can have a debate on the principle of euthanasia, not on the ancillary matters about the extent to which this is dangerous law. I want to say something about dignity. Yeah, Mr Chairman, could you just help me here, please? Mr Chairman, what sort of time do we have left here?
Mr Deputy Speaker.
8 minutes? Or?
2 minutes. 2 minutes?
2? Would you mind checking that with the clerk as I continue? Pretty sure...
5:30.
1 minute is your advice.
All right, that's a shame. Well, I guess I should wrap up. Mr Deputy Speaker, I do believe that however the interjections and the debate plays out, I do believe that in our hearts we all want what's best for Tasmanians. I don't prejudice members... Mr Booth, please. I don't prejudice members who have a point of view, and in many cases, including my own, I came to Parliament with a view. It hasn't changed. I understand that we all are on a different journey and we all have a different value set and perspective and worldview. What I would say, though, is that we need to protect everyone. I accept and understand there will be individual cases which make an excellent example for why the intent of this legislation has merit, but that must be matched up against with a competing priority. For many, it is the sanctity of human life. But for all of us, it ought to be the protection of the vulnerable.
Member's time has expired.
I thank the House.